Just after 5 in the evening, on the 26th of November, 1943, a 19-year-old lieutenant from Fresno named Robert Brewer looked out through a porthole on a crowded troopship and saw something he could not place. 60 years later, he still told it the same way. "I saw what I thought was a pursuit craft," he said, "stubby wings, on fire at the tail. That fire was a rocket engine, and this thing was coming straight at our ship. It was low over the water, faster than any aircraft he knew. And it was turning the way nothing falling out of the sky is supposed to turn, holding its line on the ship as if something were steering it." Brewer was one of nearly 2,000 American soldiers aboard His Majesty's transport Rohna, an aging British liner near the front of a convoy off the coast of Algeria. They had boarded on Thanksgiving Day, bound for the far side of the world. Most of them had never been shot at. They were only now, this evening, in the war at all. The thing with the stubby wings crossed the last of the open water and struck the Rohna low on her port side, near the engine room, into a troop deck packed with men. What followed over the next 90 minutes would kill more than 1,000 American servicemen. It is, to this day, the greatest loss of American life at sea from enemy action in the country's history. More than the battleships at Pearl Harbor. More than the Indianapolis. And almost none of the men who lived through it would be allowed to say so. Their families would receive a telegram with 3 words on it: "Killed in action," and "no ship, no place, no reason." For the rest of their lives, most of them would never be told what had come out of the dusk that evening. It was the future of war, and the country it hurt most would bury it, along with its dead, for the better part of 50 years. The men who survived spent years not knowing what had hit them. The escorts did not know either. In the war diary of the American warship steaming a few hundred yards off, the line for that evening records only this: "The transport struck by a large bomb on the forecastle." That was what they could see, and that was all anyone wrote down. It was not a bomb, or it was a bomb, the way the first of anything is the thing it will become. What came out of the dusk was a Henschel 293, and it was the first weapon of its kind that actually worked. It was a small aircraft, really, a little over 10 feet across the wings, with 1,000 pounds of high explosive in its belly, and a rocket motor slung underneath. The rocket burned for about 10 seconds, long enough to throw the weapon forward faster than the bomber that had carried it, and then it ran on as a glider. It was the world's first guided missile to sink ships, and the thing that made it new is that it did not fall. It was flown. Here is how it worked. The bomber never came near the convoy's guns. It stayed off at a distance, 6 miles, sometimes 10, and flew a straight line parallel to its target, well outside the range of the anti-aircraft fire. Somewhere out there, in the back of that aircraft, a German airman took hold of a small joystick. In the tail of the falling missile sat 5 colored flares, the very fire Brewer saw, burning bright enough to be picked up for miles. And the operator simply kept those flares lined up on the ship and flew the thing down by eye, sending his corrections out over a radio link from the aircraft to a receiver in the bomb. He could not feel the wind on it or hear the men it was falling toward. He watched a point of light, and he nudged it again, the way you might steer a model across a pond. A man sitting safe in an airplane, flying a bomb into a ship, by hand, from miles away. Nothing in the war had done that before. The squadrons that flew these weapons had been hunting with them since the late summer, and by the evening off Algeria, they were good at it. The first kill had come at the end of August in the Bay of Biscay, when a formation of German bombers sank the British sloop Egret. That was the first ship in history destroyed by a guided weapon, and it shook the Allies enough that they pulled their anti submarine patrols back out of the bay for a time, simply to keep them away from it. Through the autumn, the weapon worked its way across the Mediterranean, crippling warships, breaking troop ships, striking even a hospital ship lit up and marked plainly with the Red Cross. By the end, it had damaged or sunk something like 24 vessels. And it had opened a kind of fight the world had barely seen before. A war waged not with shells, but with radio waves. One of the first duels of jamming and counter-jamming in the history of warfare. In the last months of 1943, there was no reliable way to stop it. That was the thing turning toward the Rohna in the last of the light. 2,000 soldiers who had never seen combat and bearing down on them a glimpse of the way wars would be fought for the next 80 years. To see how those 90 minutes actually unfolded, you can follow them in the logs of the ships that were there. Around 20 minutes to 5, by the count in one American escort's diary, somewhere between 24 and 30 German aircraft came in on the convoy, and the escorts went to battle stations and opened fire. Bombs fell close aboard. A handful of friendly fighters caught one of the big bombers and chased it, and the gunners watched it trail smoke, curve away, release its weapons, and put them into a long, steep glide down toward the ships. The Rohna was the third ship in the second column. Just after 5, the shape that Robert Brewer had seen from his porthole came down on her, and the whole convoy threw itself into an emergency turn 80 degrees and kept going. The escorts did not stop fighting when she was hit. The same warship whose log called it only a large bomb spent the next hour in a running battle, firing hundreds of rounds, picking up an aircraft on radar in the dark, catching a torpedo plane in its guns, and watching it burst into flames and go into the sea. Then, laying a smokescreen across the water, the convoy fought hard that evening. It simply could not fight the one weapon that mattered, because that weapon was already inside the ship. The missile had gone in low on the port side, into the troop decks where the men were quartered. Robert Brewer watched it go in about 30 feet below his porthole. There was a terrible explosion, he said. I felt no fire, but I found myself out in a hallway from the blast. The hit killed roughly 300 men where they stood, many from a single engineer battalion bunked in the afterdecks, close to the point of impact. It tore through the hull, killed the lights, killed the engines, and started a fire the crew could not get ahead of. A sergeant from that battalion, Louis Markovitz, was at the very bottom of the ship when it struck. The bomb had hit the engine room, he remembered, and it was dark. He felt his way up the stairs to a deck already full of confusion. What followed was made worse by things that had nothing to do with the enemy. Many of the Rohna's lifeboats could not be launched. Some had been wrecked in the blast. Others were rusted to their davits and would not move. Manny Carvalho, a tank driver from Fall River who could not really swim, came up from below into the middle of it. They had 100 life jackets for 1,100 guys, he said. What am I going to do? Everything's on fire. Everything's exploding. He found one anyway, looked at the drop, 3 stories from the rail to the sea, and went in. Brewer went down a rope slick with blood from the men sliding ahead of him, into the water with a navy belt he inflated and pushed up under his arms, the way it was meant to be worn. Many men did not know to do that. Worn low, around the waist, the same belt pitched a man forward and held his face under. And a great many of them drowned that way, killed by the thing that was supposed to save them. How much of the toll was the bomb, and how much was the boats and the belts, became an argument that outlived most of the men who could have settled it. It has never been settled. Then came the water, and the water is most of the story. The convoy could not stop. That is the hard arithmetic of a convoy. To halt is to hand the rest of the ships to the bombers still overhead. And so the convoy steamed on into the dark and left the Rohna burning behind it, and left the men in the sea to wait. From the deck, just before he went over, Brewer had looked out and seen, in his words, for blocks and blocks, people in the water. He had never seen so many men in the water, and this within about 40 minutes of the attack. For most of them, the wait ran into the night. The sea was cold, past bearing. The waves were tremendous, Markevitz said, and it was absolutely unbearably cold. He kept his arms and legs moving to keep the blood in them. Somewhere in the dark, he came on 4 men he knew, one of them from his own squad, a soldier named Cranston, who kept calling out to him, "Help me, Mark. Help me, Mark." Markevitz had picked up a spare life preserver floating in the water. He worked it under the man's arm and rested his chin on it, and then he swam away, because, he said, there was nothing I could do. I was about gone myself. None of those 4 men were saved. Brewer drifted alone on purpose, steering clear of the clusters of men gathered around a piece of wreckage, because panic spread in them. It got dark, he said. The sea was choppy, some of the waves full of oil, some of the oil on fire. He swallowed the oil and was sick, as others were. He lost the feeling in his legs after a few hours. It was a clear night, and he lay back and looked at the stars and thought, well, come and find me. I'm out here. He was in the water about 8 hours before a small British rescue tug, the Mindful, found him and pulled him over the rail. She already had 250 survivors aboard. He could not understand how she stayed afloat. The largest single rescue was made by an American minesweeper, the Pioneer, under a commander named Roy Rogers. There is an odd, lonely line in her log from that night. Convoy Commodore unknown. Nobody aboard her even knew for certain who had been running the convoy she had just been pulled out of. Her men went over the side, on lines and off, into the cold water in the darkness, in the words of the Navy's own account, with German aircraft still working the area. Her captain turned on the ship's searchlights, which is very nearly the same as painting a target on your own hull, and kept them burning. And the crew hauled men up out of the oil until, by the account in her log, there was no more room aboard to put them. 606 people came onto the Pioneer that night. Tugs and destroyers, and a French vessel took off the rest, through the dark, a few at a time. The last of the living were lifted from the sea more than 8 hours after the bomb struck. Then the count began, and the count is the part that is hard to take in. Of the men in that one engineer battalion, of nearly 800, 126 answered the roll the next morning. More than 1,000 American soldiers were dead. Somewhere above 1,100 were lost in all. No single act of an enemy, before or since, has cost the United States more lives at sea. And it had been done by one weapon, one, out of more than 40 launched against the convoy that evening. The only one of them to find a ship. The thing that makes a guided weapon terrible is the same thing that can kill it. It listens. A bomb that only falls obeys gravity, and there is no arguing with gravity. But the Henschel obeyed a man on a radio, and a radio can be lied to. It took the Allies most of a year to learn how. The early attempts failed. The jammers tuned to the wrong frequencies, while the operators flew their weapons home untouched. Then, piece by piece, helped by an intact missile captured at Anzio, and the heart of a control transmitter pulled from a German bomber that crashed on Corsica. The engineers learned not just to blind the weapon, but to take it. By the spring of 1944, an Allied jammer could break into the command link and fly the missile down into the empty sea with a steady run of false turns. The thing that could not be stopped was, more and more often, being flown into the ocean by the very people it was aimed at. The Germans tried to slip the noose with a version guided down a wire and another steered by television, but neither was ready before the war ended. The first guided missile in history had been beaten, and not by armor and not by guns. It was beaten by an invisible signal, by the one weakness built into the very thing that had made it deadly. The men of the Rohna got none of that. No turning of the tide reached the water that night, and no part of the story reached their families afterward. Wartime censorship closed over the whole thing at once, from the very top. The survivors were told, in plain words, to say nothing. Brewer remembered the order from his commanders exactly. You don't mention it. You don't mention a submarine. You don't mention the word air-to-ground missile. You don't mention anything about hundreds of men being lost. The officers censored the enlisted men's mail, and other officers censored theirs, so that nothing of what had happened could go home in a letter. We kept quiet for 5 years, Carvalho said. We were told, you don't talk about that, or you get court-martialed. So, he didn't. I just put it out of my mind, he said. I never talked about it. Their families, meanwhile, got the telegram, killed in action, and nothing more. Not the name of the ship. Not the sea it had happened in. Not what had done it. For months, the government would say only that more than 1,000 men had been lost aboard a troopship it would not name, and it let the country assume a submarine had done it. The casualty figures and the name Rohna did not come out until the summer of 1945, and even then, the official word was German aircraft, with no mention of a guided missile. The full account waited until a newspaper ran it in 1947. The details the government held back waited until 1967. For most of the men who had been in that water, the truth of what killed their friends stayed locked away for the better part of their lives. When it finally came out, it came out because the survivors dragged it out. They found each other, decades on, and formed an association. Markovitz, the sergeant who had swum away from his dying friend, became its president, gathering the names and recording the testimony. Brewer went to his own congressman and asked for help. Another survivor worked with his representative until the matter went before the House of Representatives and on to the public record. In 1993, an American broadcast finally laid the whole story in front of the country, and the line the anchor used is the truest thing anyone has said about it. It is not that we forgot. It is that we never knew. A memorial went up in 1996, and in the year 2000, for the first time, the Congress of the United States entered the Rohna and its dead into the record by name, and stated plainly that a German guided missile had killed more than 1,000 American soldiers off the coast of Algeria on the 26th of November, 1943. 57 years after the fact. The first time, the country said it out loud. The thing that came out of the dusk that evening was the first of its kind ever to take a ship, and it set the pattern for everything that followed. The cruise missile, the smart bomb, the drone with a man at a screen a continent away, the long, quiet war over who owns the airwaves above a battlefield. All of it traces back to weapons like the one off Algeria, where a man with a joystick flew a bomb into a ship full of soldiers who never saw it coming, and for the most part never learned what it was. That makes the men of the Rohna something the record did not hold at the time and was slow to hold later. They were the largest group of Americans ever killed by a guided weapon, by a bomb that a man miles away flew into them on purpose. The first, in a real sense, of a kind of loss the world has had a great deal of since. They were on a ship that was not theirs, in a war they had only just entered, killed by a machine out of the next era of fighting, and then folded into a silence that lasted longer than many of them would have lived in peacetime. It took their own country 57 years to say their names. Almost none of what you have just heard came out of a textbook. It came from the war diary of the ship that wrote down only a large bomb, from files that stayed classified for decades, and from the men themselves who were ordered to keep quiet and then, when they were old, refused any longer to be quiet. Robert Brewer, who lay on his back in the oil and the cold and told the stars to come and find him. Manny Carvalho, who could not swim and went over the rail anyway. Louis Markovitz, who put a life preserver under a dying man's chin and carried that for the rest of his days. The names are not all lost. There were units aboard the Rohna with men from every corner of the country. The 853rd Engineers, Markovitz's battalion. The 322nd Fighter Control Squadron. The 31st Signal Construction Battalion. The 44th Portable Surgical Hospital, and others. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle shipped out with one of them, or if he was one of the men pulled out of that water, leave his name in the comments. These men were kept silent once. They do not have to disappear twice. Tell us he was here.